Welcome to Casual Friday. Hi, I'm Roxanne Richardson, and this is my weekly Casual Friday podcast. In this week's podcast, I have tidbits, and I'll talk about the process of scouring raw wool fleece in preparation for spinning. So let's get started. Now that it's summertime, it's also state and county fair season here in the US at any rate. That means it is blue ribbon knitting season as well. So here in the US, county and state fairs are usually centered around agriculture. So other countries may have some other type of agricultural fair. The fair is going to have agricultural aspects like judging of different livestock. It's going to have shows like horse shows and things like that. There's going to be lots of food on sticks. There's going to be music and other entertainment as well as midway rides. So one of the things that I love about the Minnesota State Fair is the Creative Activities building. That's where all sorts of items are on display that people have entered to be judged. So it could be baked goods or canned goods. It could be woodworking, sewing, quilting, beadwork, embroidery, and of course, knitting, crocheting, weaving, and spinning. So all of those are part of the Creative Activities competitions. We have one of the biggest state fairs in the country, and for sure we have the biggest knitting competition. There are dozens of categories which can get pretty specific. So a lot of fairs might have just a few general categories like Afghans, baby clothes, and then other. Ours has separate categories for adult pullover with all over texture, or adult pullover with partial texture, adult pullover with all over color work, and then there's another one with partial color work. And then there are 4 more categories for the cardigan versions of those, and then children's versions for ages 3 to 12. In terms of the garments are made to fit somebody that size, plus additional categories for jackets and vests, and there's lots of categories for different size blankets. There's probably 4 different blanket competitions. There's also different socks and mittens and scarves of different yarn weights will each have their own category. All of this, there's literally dozens and dozens of categories. Some of the knitting is outside of the knitting competition, like baby garments are not included in the main knitting. Instead it's in children's or baby garments, and you might have crocheted hats competing with knitted hats, for example. If you have never entered a state or a county fair competition and you're thinking about it, I would say make it something fun that you're doing and don't put a lot of expectation on the outcome, because you don't know what you're competing against and you don't know what the judges are actually looking for. What I will say is that if you have judges that are specific for knitting and they really know what they're doing, they're going to look for finishing techniques. They're going to turn it inside out. They're going to look at how well you wove in your ends, how well you joined in the round, whether or not you have holes at your underarms if you're knitting a top-down sweater, whether or not your graft was as even as the rest of your stitches if you're knitting a sock toe. So I would say what's really important is the finishing work. In our fair, it tends to be about technical skill. And not just, oh, is this the most beautiful shawl you've ever seen? Is it technically more difficult than other shawls in the category? It's not enough to be technically difficult. You do want something that looks good, but it also isn't enough to look good. It needs to be something that is better in terms of technique execution or number of techniques than the other things in the category, in the same category. That's just how it works here. Regardless, it's human beings who are doing the judging, and they're going to have their biases. They're going to have things that they really prefer, and it's just best not to try to be a mind reader and think that you've got them figured out. There are a lot of people here in Minnesota who enter many items every year, and oftentimes the thing that they think, well, that's going to be a blue ribbon, a winner for sure, maybe doesn't even place. And then the thing that they just entered on a whim, they're like, oh, might as well enter this, ends up getting, first place. So there's no telling what's going to happen. Now in our fair, they have a score sheet. So there's different points for different aspects. So you can see the points that they gave you for that. And then they will give you a 1-sentence comment. That's because they are judging hundreds and hundreds of items, and that's all that they have time for. And also in our fair, if there's more than 25 entries in a particular category, they will only judge the top 25. So if I were doing this and I was trying to break it down, I would probably quickly, like, these do not look that great. These are in the middle and these look really good. And then you need to figure out the ones that were really good, how you're going to rank them, and really pay attention to the scoring on those really top category ones. They look at things like, is it blocked well? Is it clean? Because sometimes people will enter things that their toddler has been wearing and it's got stains on it. And so they won't even judge something like that if it's dirty. But again, the whole idea is to be fun, and maybe you'll get some valuable feedback of something that you never noticed in your knitting, either that's positive or that is negative, and something that to look out for next time and that you can improve on in the subsequent year. But if you are going to be really sensitive about any kind of feedback, anything negative, I would say maybe this wouldn't be the thing for you. But if you can have kind of a thick skin about it, they're usually not cruel. They're not going to say something mean. But if you are very sort of protective of your baby that you've knit and you've submitted for judging, think about that before you do something like that. And if you've never really paid attention to something like this at a fair, I would say if you're a little uneasy about entering it, go look this year. See what people enter. Look at the things that won and see if you can figure out, why did this win over something else? And be kind of analytical about it, because it isn't going to be just based on what is your favorite thing. That's not how they're going to judge something. They're going to be as objective as possible. But you have to allow for the fact that they are human beings, and there will be some subjectivity as well. So in my quest to understand more about different wool breeds, one of the things I've been trying to understand lately is some of the terminology that's used to define certain types of sheep. So there are short-tailed sheep, long-tailed sheep, and fat-tailed sheep. That's pretty easy to kind of understand that category. The short-tailed sheep tend to be amongst the oldest of what they call the woolly breeds, the ones that aren't hair sheep. So there are also primitive sheep and landrace sheep, and these are terms that I think must have at least some overlap, but aren't necessarily synonymous. So one of the things I'm learning about the so-called primitive breeds is that they seem to be of the short-tailed variety, and that their coats will grow all summer long and then they stop growing for the winter. So they're growing their coat over the summer to keep themselves warm in the winter. And then in the spring, the wool breaks. There's a break in the wool very close to the skin. And that's going to allow that winter coat to fall off so that they can be cool for the summer. And then the new coat is going to come in and grow over the course of the summer until in the fall, it's as thick as they need for the winter. So the new coat under the old, that's coming up under the old coat, is called the rise. And if the rise is weak, the wool can be shed easily. If the rise is strong, it's going to be a lot more difficult. Not all sheep are going to break at the same time. Rams apparently break first and then ewes break later, particularly if they are lambing. They might not break until after the lamb is born. So I found a really interesting video of a shepherd who raises a flock of about, I think, 75 to 79, something like that, Shetland sheep here in the US. And in the spring, she continually checks each sheep to see if their wool has broken yet, and to see if the rise is weak or strong. So if it's a weak rise, then she's going to be able to hand roo the sheep by pulling off the old wool. It might take her about 20 minutes to get the wool off that way. And that's something that hand spinners really prize, is the rooed fleece. But if the rise is strong and she can't you know, she can't easily pull it off, then she has those sheep sheared or shorn, or whatever you call it, sheared or shorn. At any rate, I'll link to the video down in the show notes. It's really helped me understand a little bit more about primitive breeds and ROOING and what all of that is. But I'm still not totally clear on the difference between a primitive breed and a landrace breed. I almost feel like Shetland sheep raised in Shetland might be a landrace sheep, because landrace is a term that pertains to anything agriculture. It could be plants or it could be animals, but it's something that has adapted to the environment that it's in, and it thrives in that environment. And it adapted on its own a long time ago. It wasn't bred into adaptation. But a Shetland sheep in the US would not be a landrace sheep, I wouldn't think, because it's been relocated to a place far away from where it adapted to its environment. So another part of the definition of primitive breeds is that they are unimproved, which means they haven't been bred to have improved characteristics. They just are the way that they are. So a couple of months ago, I was talking about the Polworth breed that was developed in Australia. They were using merino sheep that had been imported from Europe, and they weren't doing well in the really rainy parts of Victoria. And so they crossed those merinos with Lincoln Longwool breed sheep, and then they created this new breed that was adapted to the climate that it was in. So that would be something that was improved rather than something that just happened naturally when in the course of living in the environment. So again, I will leave a link down in the show notes to that video on ROOING. I found it really interesting. This tidbit came to me in my Twitter feed. It's a video from Zwartbliss, Ireland. So she's the shepherd that got me started on learning more about different wool breeds back in 2018. So she was recently at some sort of fiber festival type of thing in Ireland, and she videotaped a discussion that she had with a man who collects antique textile tools and equipment like spinning wheels and looms, and then restores them. So he had restored a walking wheel, also known as a great wheel, and then he demonstrated how to use it. So these are a type of wheel that predate spinning wheels that have treadles. So the wheel is much larger, and it was operated, the person's typically standing and they're operating the wheel with their hand. They're spinning that, and they're putting twist into the fiber as they're drafting it backwards. And then when they're ready to wind it on the spindle, then they reverse the direction of the wheel, and they move to the position of the wool that they've been spinning, and then they wind it onto the wheel. So they spin the wheel in different directions depending on whether they are putting the twist into the wool or if they were just winding it onto the bobbin. I've always dreamed kind of being able to try out a walking wheel. I've thought about what if I found one somewhere, but they're so big, and there's just, I don't have room for something like that. But recently, I found out that many spinning wheels have an attachment that you can put on your wheel that replaces like the flyer bobbin mechanism, and instead you put on a quill attachment, and then you could do this woolen spun spinning on the quill in a similar way to how you do it on the walking wheel, but instead of manually turning the wheel in different directions, you would treadle, and then you would reverse the direction that you're treadling depending on what part of it you're doing. And I thought, well, that's really interesting. Now the thing is, you can do woolen spun, you can spin woolen spun yarn on a treadle spinning wheel using your flyer and bobbin. So I don't know if there is an advantage of using a quill, or if it's just something that's sort of more related to a walking wheel and you can understand better how they used to do that. I'm just fascinated by this, and I'm wondering if if any of you out there have tried a quill or have a quill and use it. I think you can even put them on an e-spinner. So it's just an interesting concept to me, and I'm wondering if that's something that I want to try out. So even if I never have the chance to try spinning on a great wheel, I could try doing this on my actual regular treadle spinning wheel. So let me know down in the comments if you've ever used a quill attachment on your spinning wheel. This tidbit came to me from Mary Inman via email. It's a link to a museum exhibit in Norway called Ultra Terra, Why Wool Matters. The exhibit is going on now through October, but there is online content that you can look at and listen to as well. So part of the description of this exhibit is as follows. This tour has 4 stories about the relationship between sheep and humans. You'll hear about topics such as co-domestication, colonialism, breeding, and wool waste, and how this relationship has become so interconnected. So they've also have a piece of original music that was composed for this exhibit, and it incorporates the sound of sheep as well as the shepherds out in the fields. If you want to check it out online, I'll leave a link down below. There are 5 different audio clips that you can listen to that range from like 2 minutes to 6 minutes that cover just different aspects of the exhibition, the 4 stories. So it looks like a really cool exhibit. I wish I could go to it myself. Last week, I was telling you about some rare breed wools that I bought at Shepherd's Harvest, which is our local fiber festival, as well as some additional rare breed wools that I bought from Selbu Spinnery in Norway. So my plan is to spin them up, or at least get started on spinning them up during Tour de Fleece, which starts July 1st and coincides with Tour de France. Unlike Tour de France, Tour de Fleece is not a competition. There's no winner of Tour de Fleece. The idea is to set yourself a spinning challenge for the 3 weeks of the tour and then just to have fun with it. So for me, it's a motivator to do something that I want to do, but to make sure that I actually do it. It gets that little kick in the pants. The wools that I bought from Norway were already washed. So, you know, there's issues with shipping raw fleece from one country to another, but the wools that I bought at Shepherd's Harvest were raw and needed to be scoured. So I decided this was an opportunity to come up with a scouring process that would work well for me. I hadn't been happy with the way that I had done it before, so I wanted a better setup, one that was, you know, efficient, produced consistent results, and was safe. My friend Celeste had taught me to scour wool a few years ago when we split a fleece from the Shepherd's Harvest silent auction. And the process at her house was pretty straightforward and pretty easy. But it wasn't one that I could replicate at my house, in part because of the layout of our house versus her house, but also because our hot water heater just won't heat water to the temperature that's anywhere near hot enough to scour wool, even if we turn up the temperature on the water heater. We have anti-scalding safety features on our faucets, so the maximum that we can get from the tap is about 120 degrees Fahrenheit, but wool needs a much higher temperature than that in order to get the lanolin out, which means that I have to carry boiling water through the house and down some stairs in order to get water that's hot enough. And that is neither safe nor efficient. So after I went to the open house at Utopia Yarn Mill back in April and I saw their setup for scouring, I started thinking about how I could adapt their setup, which is, you know, for commercial purposes, how I could adapt that to a smaller scale using equipment that I had on hand. So they had this enormous triple sink for scouring wool. It was really deep. Each sink was really deep, and they had a water heater right next to the sink that could heat water up to 180 degrees. So it didn't have to travel through any pipes to get to the sink, and the water is super hot. They also had a giant spin dryer next to the sink that could spin out the water between scourings and after the final rinse. So I, of course, need something that's a much smaller scale, but I do have 2 large pots that I use for dyeing. So one of them is one of those enamel pots. They're like canning pots. So they're really big, and I've used those for dyeing, but they could act as the 2 separate sinks where I could scour in one and then take it out and then put it in the next one. So, and I have a spin dryer that I use to spin out water when I hand wash knitted items. And also when I make, if I dye yarn and I need to spin the water out of the yarn, all of that kind of thing. And when I bought it, I was thinking, oh, this would also be good for spinning water out of raw fleece after it's been scoured. So I have, some equipment that I think could work as a substitute for the giant sinks and the giant spin dryer. Trish from Fiber Love Diary mentioned a while back, a month or 2 ago, that once the weather warmed up, she'd be able to wash her bags of raw fleece that she had because she washes them outside. So it's going to be warm enough to do that. And I thought, well, that's a great idea, because then I wouldn't have to worry about dumping the dirty, lanolin filled water down the pipes. I've done that before, but because I don't wash a lot of raw fleece, I haven't been too worried about it. But, as an ongoing thing, I just as soon not do that. So I'd be able, if I was doing it outside, I could just dump all the hot water on the weeds in my backyard. Maybe then I wouldn't have to pull them. So there was still one big problem I had to solve, was how was I going to get scalding hot water outside? I could heat water in the kitchen that would be hot enough. Like I could get the tap water and then heat it up, further. But then getting that water down to the patio created a safety issue, because we live on a hill. And in order to get to our backyard, we have to go down a flight of stairs. And that would mean that I would be carrying a 2-handled pot that had like 2 gallons of water in it, down a flight of stairs where I couldn't see my feet, I couldn't hold on to anything, and if I slipped, I would scald myself. So that was a huge safety issue that I worried about. Again, not safe and not terribly efficient. So I did end up buying one piece of new equipment, and that is a little countertop burner, like a stove burner, but it's just like a countertop electric one. So rather than carrying scalding hot water down in a pot with 2 hands, I could carry hot tap water in a bucket using one hand, and then I'd be able to see where I was, and if I needed to get a handhold, I could. And if it spilled on me, it wasn't going to scald me in the same way that much hotter water would. So I'd be able to carry that water down, fill up the pot on my little countertop burner, and then heat it up to the temperature that I needed. So one of the things my friend Celeste had taught me when she was showing me her process for scouring wool was that she just used Dawn dish detergent. A lot of people do that for scouring wool. But in the past couple of years, I've started using the Unicorn products for doing my hand washing. So I use, fiber wash to like wash a sweater or a hat or whatever, and it's slightly alkaline. That's how detergent works, and this was really good at pulling out the dirt and keeping it suspended in the water. And so after you wash that for 10-15 minutes, then you put it in rinse water with this fiber rinse, which returns it back to its acidic pH that wool really likes. So these are the products I use just to wash regular wool. But they have a third product which I hadn't had a chance to use yet, and that is called Power Scour, and this is meant for scouring wool. So this was something I hadn't used yet, but I wanted to try out. And I also needed to kind of refresh my memory in terms of how exactly hot the water needed to be, how long everything needed to soak, how many washes I needed to do, and how many rinses I needed to do. I just couldn't really remember. And I also wanted to use the Power Scour. So I decided to try the method that Clemis and Clemis has on their website. They are a father-son team who make drum carders and other tools for spinners, but they also buy up raw fleeces during Fiber Festival season and then scour them at the end of the season for their, I think it's called Good Clean Wool's like subscription service. So that if you want to do the prep but you hate scouring, then you can just buy whatever quantity you want of the clean wool from them. They had really kind of systematized their process for scouring wool. And they explain how they do it on kind of the bigger scale, where they use like a big washing machine. You know, they don't have the agitator. They just use it as a giant vessel, and they can clean several pounds of fleece at a time. But they also gave instructions for how you could do up to 1 pound at a time in using 2 gallons of water for each of the washing and rinsing cycles. And so that's what I decided to do. And they also use the unicorn products, and they said exactly how much to use at each stage. So to me, it was like, okay, the formula I have from them and I trust them. And then I have my other equipment and my process for doing it outside. So, and I'll leave a link if you're interested in seeing their breakdown of how they do their process. I'll leave a link to their website, to that page down in the show notes. So here is how it goes. So first of all, you do an overnight soak. You just fill up 2 gallons, cool water, and you get some kind of a mesh bag that's going to be the right size for the amount of fleece that you're washing. I was doing like 4 ounces and 4 ounces, so I was using the little bitty bags. But if you're doing a full pound of one type of thing, you know, use one that's a little bit bigger. So you have the 2 gallons of cool water, and you have a half a teaspoon of Power Scour in there, and it's cool water, and you just soak it overnight. And so this gets all of the, you know, the big dirt off, and it kind of coats the fibers with the Power Scour so that they're ready to get clean. So then in the morning, I pull out the bag, dump the water, and then I put this in my spin dryer and spin the water out of it. And so now I'm ready to scour. So the first scouring is a tablespoon of Power Scour in 2 gallons of water that's 160 degrees Fahrenheit. You put this in there, and then I covered the pot with some towels to keep it insulated so it wouldn't lose too much of the heat. If the water gets too cool, then the lanolin's going to reattach. So you're supposed to soak it for 20 to 25 minutes. And while it was soaking for then I'm heating up the next 2 gallons of hot tap water on the countertop burner. Then I can just sit there for about 20 minutes knitting or pulling weeds or making breakfast, doing whatever. I have 20 minutes. So then I take those out, put them in the spin dryer, and while the spin dryer is running, I can dump the old hot water, fill it up with a new bucket of hot tap water, move the already hot tap water over to the table where it's going to soak. And this time I put half a tablespoon of Power Scour in there. And by that time the spin dryer is ready to be turned off. I get them out and put them in the second scouring water and let it sit for 20 minutes while the other water is heating up. So then there's a third scouring, which also uses a half a tablespoon of the Power Scour. And then there is the first rinse is just water. So 160 degree water, but because you're just getting that soap out of the fleece. And then the final rinse is, again, it's in 160 degree water, and you have a half a tablespoon of the fiber rinse. So you're returning the wool back to its acidic pH that it likes. And at this point, you can just leave it to cool off, you know, and I just left it until the afternoon, because you don't need to keep it you only need to keep everything at that 160 degree temperature while you're moving it from one container to the other. Once it cools down, you can, if you're in the last one, you can just let it all cool down. So once I figured out, what I was going to do, how I was going to set everything up, that took me, a little while in the morning to get that worked out. And I started heating up the first pot of water right at 8 o'clock. And then at 10 o'clock was when I put the wool into the final rinse, and then I could start putting all my equipment away. And then I just left that pot there in the afternoon until it was cool enough for me to just stick my hand in. And then I did the final spin out and then laid everything out to dry. So and then I took notes so that I know what equipment I need next time. I don't have to think about that. I took notes for my process and how I choreographed everything. But I was really happy with that. But I think the main takeaway is just like with knitting or really anything, there are multiple ways of getting to the same end point. There are multiple ways of scouring fleece, and the way I described it may not be the way that you do it and that you like to do it, but there's a lot of different ways. And if you're just getting started in learning all this stuff, try a couple of different ways. Like, I was not happy with the first, I was happy with Celeste's way, but I couldn't do it here. And I was unhappy with my results. And so I'm like, okay, how am I going to improve this? And now I'm much happier, and I have a process that's going to work for me. And that's all that's important, is that this is working for me. But again, I'll leave links to the Clemis & Clemis site. I'll leave links to like the unicorn stuff too, in case you're interested in that. I think some yarn shops sell them, but I usually just buy it directly from them. We can go to the overhead and I can show you what these look like. I'll see if I can put in clips of what it looked like last week before it had been washed, and then what it looked like this week. So this is what was called it was a rare mutation. The sheep isn't rare, but the mutation was rare. So this is the black nose valet, and it says lamb's wool. And what was rare about it is that the sheep are supposed to be white all over with just a black face and maybe black little knee pads. But once in a while, you'll get one that has black over more of its body. And so this one has some black in it. This particular bit of it that I have is mostly white, but there is a fair amount of black in here. I'll put on the screen what it looked like before and then what it looks like now. And of course, there's going to be more to do with this, you know, in terms of carding it or combing, and that's what I'm investigating right now, is what is going to be the best way to process this in preparing to spin it. The other thing I'm going to do, I'm going to weigh this. So this was exactly 4 ounces when I bought it raw. So it's 3.375 ounces now. So I lost about 2/3 of an ounce of lanolin and sweat and dirt, you know, all that kind of thing from the process of scouring it. So not a huge percentage at all. Someone had said to me in the comments last week that this isn't going to be terribly soft. It's going to be a little softer than a regular adult sheep would be of this particular breed. And I would say that's accurate. It's on the coarser side. That is absolutely true. So this one is a Norwegian spell sow. So this is a dual coated sheep. I will show you what it looked like before, and then now you can see what it looks like now. So this one, actually, there is quite a bit of, it's a dual coat, which means that the outer coat is longer and coarser, and then it has this downy undercoat. And this downy undercoat is really nice. The spell sow, what they used to use the outer coat for, and they've done this in some replicas. I was talking about these sailing vessels, these Viking sails that use wool for their sails last week. This is the breed of sheep that they used to use to make the sails. They used this outer coat of the dual coat, so that would make a very tough, wind-resistant, strong fiber for weaving the sails, and then the under stuff they would use, I guess, for clothing. And I don't blame them. This is really nice. So this one, I had 5.4 ounces of it raw, and it's really fluffed up. So we'll see if I can get this in the little container. I reset the tare with the bag so I can just weigh it in the bag. So I have 4.2 ounces now. So I lost 1.2 ounces during the scouring process of this. So not a huge amount, maybe, you know, 20% maybe I lost of this one. So not too bad. So this is the Swedish fennel. I had scoured it before last week when I was kind of trying to figure out my scouring process. Remember, I think it was 4 ounces. It might have been a little bit more than 4, and it's 3.175 now. So I lost at least 25% of this, possibly more if it actually weighed more than 4 ounces to begin with. So this is what this looks like before it's had any prep other than washing. I want to show you what it looks like when I use one of the tools that I got from Clemis & Clemis. it's this thing here. It's like a flick. There's a little thing that looks like a little brush where you can flick open the ends of these locks to open them up so that you can put them through a drum carder or whatever. Clemis and Clemis has this thing called a lock pop, and you can clamp it to the table, and then instead of holding the lock in one hand and the brush in the other, this is clamped to the table, and then you can use both hands. So normally this is supposed to be, clamped to the table, but you just put it down and then lift it up a few times. And then you can pull it out, and then you can do the same thing in the other direction. Lift it up, put it back down, lift it up a few times until you've opened it up, and then that just fluffs this out. So I could just spin this right now from the locks. They've been opened up, and I could just spin it from that, or I can do something else like comb these or card these or something else. But you can see what a difference it makes once you open it up, how white and fluffy it is compared to kind of what it looks like right here. Well, that's it for this week's Casual Friday. If you have any comments or questions about today's video or suggestions for videos you'd like to see in the future, you can leave those down in the comments below. Or join the discussion in my Ravelry group, Rocks. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you next week.